The Bible Treasury. A monthly magazine of papers on scriptural subjects. Article 14, Volume 14, 1882 and 1883. Idolatry. Our beacon. Man is religious by nature, and the only creature of all that lives upon the earth that was originally created with sentiments and faculties needed for religion, that is, a creature capable of apprehending a supreme being, and with a feeling or sentiment of veneration for him. Man has many faculties in common with the animal creation, as seeing, hearing, and others wherein the lower animal excels man. In the mental faculties, the attempt to compare the brute with man is idle. The most sagacious animal is separated from man by an impassable gulf. Scripture declares this difference, and also that to know the spirit of the beast that goeth downward is as much beyond the reach of man as to know the spirit of man that goeth upward. What we do learn from Ecclesiastes 3 verse 21 is that the spirit of man is immortal, and comparing it with Ecclesiastes 12 verse 7, that it is capable of worshipping God. Man was formed to be such. All creation is to the praise of the Creator, but man's praise is the homage of his will. But this capacity to offer intelligent praise is necessarily accompanied by responsibility, and we know that in the case of the first man his sense of responsibility was not a mere vague impression, but was made tangible to his mind by the prohibition of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, a commandment with the penalty of death attached. This one test was given, and by it is proof of man's capacity to apprehend God, i.e., one to whom he owed obedience, but also his inability to abide in innocency. The tree was the visible means of paying homage to God, the witness of his subjection to the authority of his Maker. Obedience would secure to him all the blessings of Eden, it was the link which bound him to God. That link is the obedience of the will. Being disobedient, he lost his status before God, lost his happiness and was turned out of the garden. The original link was broken, it could never be reformed. If man was ever to be again in relationship with God, it must be on entirely new ground. Into that garden, he could never re-enter. It was a garden of delights for innocence alone. And guilt once incurred makes a return to it impossible. There may be forgiveness, there may be purgation from guilt, and blessed be God, both are of grace, but the fact of guilt in the past is as true as the fact of forgiveness. God has provided a new garden where the guilty may be restored to more than the pleasures of Eden. That new garden is anticipated by faith, and there is found forgiveness of sins and eternal life in Christians. Disobedience and expulsion from Eden did not bring man down to the evil of the irresponsible creature. God had breathed into him the breath of life. This breath of life is not an emanation of the deity, as some phrase it, meaning thereby that man is a part of God, which not only denies the personality of God but leaves no room even for the idea of sin. For if man be a part of God, all that he does must be the doing of God, and all that he is must be the expression of God. Therefore, since all is God, sin is impossible, or God is contrary to himself. This is blasphemy. There is no form of infidelity so absurd as this, for even atheism does not make the deeds of sinners to be the acts of God, which must be if the soul be a part of the deity. This is the germ of pantheism. The breath of life is not a partaking of the nature of God, but the gift of immortality. Sin did not destroy this gift. Man was still as he was before, namely, immortal as to his soul, religious as to his nature. It is this religiousness of nature which makes his fall to be his ruin. The consciousness, not acquired but innate, of a power above himself who in some measure influences if not absolutely controls his condition and shapes his destiny, together with a somewhat vague idea of his accountability, which is only the complement of immortality, are doubtless in man the springs of idolatry. That is the faculties with which the Creator endowed man that he might be a worshipper of God, make him through the fall an idolater. When was idolatry developed? Not before the flood. Some think that a comparison of Genesis 6 verse 5 with Romans 1 verse 23 gives ground to believe that idolatry, as we now accept the term, existed before the flood. But the silence of Scripture as to idolatry, and its express statement that violence and corruption at that time filled the whole earth does not afford solid ground for that opinion. It is not that nature was less fallen then, but it is evidence of the kind of slavery in which Satan held the antediluvian race. In a thraldom which needed not false gods to rivet their chains, they were led on by Satan to the objects which nature presented, things to be seen and handled, not to deify them but to make them subservient to themselves and for their gratification. Satan in the garden said, "Ye shall be as gods," and man was truly led on by him to the possession of power over the material things around him. We find among the antediluvians the cultivation of those arts which are said to ameliorate the condition of man. They builded cities, were artificers in brass and iron, and learned to handle the harp and organ. Modern civilization is gauged by progress in these and their cognate subjects. We can scarcely suppose that the city built by Cain was a mere assemblage of rude huts. And it is certain that some scientific knowledge was necessary to produce brass, copper and iron from the ore, and mechanical skill to be artificers. See the fine arts too, for the harp and the organ seldom stands alone in a community. Proficiency in all is surely not to be looked for in the same individual, but in cities where one of the fine arts flourishes, there also will be found men who excel in others. Among the antediluvians was the genius that invented instruments of music, as well as the knowledge that dug in the earth for ore, and planned a city. And in the origination, the discovery, or invention, of these and other things, the men before the flood had as much intelligence and material wisdom as any after the flood. There is not the slightest reason to infer that the antediluvian organ was rude and ill-made as compared with the modern instrument of the same name. If any inference can be made from their circumstances, it might be shown without any strain that there is sufficient ground for saying that their instruments might be superior to those we know spite of modern improvement, and that those who lived before the flood excelled in all that which the world has ever boasted since. There were giants in those days. Is that a mere reference to physical strength and immense form? Is it not quite as much, and perhaps especially, to mental and intellectual greatness? Giant intellect is no uncommon expression now. But the Bible calls attention to the rapid and immense progress of the antediluvian race in the arts of civilization. There were giants in the earth in those days, and among the inventors were Jubal and Tubal-Cain long before. But their advance in those things that herald civilization, or follow in its wake, did not prevent the earth being filled with violence and corruption, and putting their evil side by side with their knowledge. What a meaning is found in Ecclesiastes 7 verse 29: God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions, that is, the things that now make this world pleasant to man, which refine his manners, which extend his power over nature, are not incompatible with the reign of sin and death. No doubt God has overruled the inventions and discoveries familiar to us to meet the need of man. He has permitted human knowledge and power to increase wonderfully, and he is wise and good in permitting it. But we do not forget that man was a sinner when he discovered and invented. It is not improbable that all the knowledge of the antediluvians perished with them in the flood, unless we can suppose that Noah and his sons had acquired the whole encyclopedia and so carried it on to the next generation. But if so, why did 9 centuries elapse before we read of instruments of music when Miriam and the women of Israel took timbrels to sing unto Jehovah? It is far more probable all previous knowledge lost that this length of time was clue to the fact of man having to begin the world's history over again. His life was reduced to a tithe of what it had been, with less energy, and less skill, either acquired by use or imparted by supernatural agency. He neither multiplied so fast nor subdued the earth so rapidly. And it may be that post-diluvians have only partially rediscovered and reinvented what had been lost in the flood. This was a loss which man could to some extent remedy, but there was a loss which no effort of his could supply, the true knowledge of God. Man did not like to retain the knowledge of God, therefore he was given up to the evil resulting from his ignorance. Before the flood, there was no direct interposition. God had his witnesses but confined to the thin line of Abel, Enoch, and Noah, which reached to the deluge. Their faith and righteousness was the sole testimony, and there being no public revelation, if we may so say, the power of Satan was not seen in denying it or opposing it by idolatry. The word in Genesis 4 verse 26, "Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord," does not necessarily mean that they were righteous, it may simply mean that the idea of God was not wholly lost. For Adam was yet alive. But after that judgment the earth being overflowed with water perished, which would not fail to impress the next generation with the power of God. The religious element of man's nature was developed, and being ignorant of God he became the dupe of Satan, and a worshipper of idols. And idolatry soon became universal. To them it's evil, and to recall to the true knowledge of himself, God separated Abram from his kindred and his country. He was called out from idolatry. His family, in common with other families of the country, were idolaters. His separation from the family did not separate the family from idolatry, for we find it with Laban long after. The knowledge of God being lost, man turned to the resources of his own mind to fill the void. It was soon filled with an object that never attracted love, though it raised fear. The homage paid was the price for averting its wrath. In fact, the object took its character from that of its votaries. The debased Egyptian adored an ox, reptiles, leeks, the cruel Canaanite, and the Israelite after him, burnt his children in honor of Moloch. The sensual Greek and Roman gave qualities to their gods unfit to name. Going farther east we find idolatry perhaps less cruel and equally sensual, but their idols horrid and monstrous in form. There is, however, many the differences arising from climate, country, and character, one feature found in all the forms of idolatry: all contain the idea of propitiation, whether by fruits of the earth, or by blood of animals, or human sacrifices. The god must be appeased. As both the idol and the homage given are products of fallen nature, which is both sinful and cruel, no marvel if the offering of human blood was reckoned the most acceptable. But whatever the form or the victim, propitiation implies a feeling, and a previous idea, however ill-defined, of having become obnoxious to the wrath of the idol. Does not this show that a sense of sin, doubtless very vague and therefore of dread, is innate? And seeing this universal dread of wrath, what so likely, or so calculated, to produce it as the traditional accounts of the deluge, of which in dim and misty lines every nation has the record? For let atheists deny God as they may, the feeling of being obnoxious to his wrath is found more or less in all, and the worldwide history of idolatry gives evidence of it. Nor are instances wanting of defiant infidels confessing it in moments of fear. Conscience may be lulled for a time, but, when not seared as with a hot iron, sometimes speaks in words of utter despair. Man must have his God, otherwise, he would not be man. Nor can the object of homage be always a mere abstraction, as Brahm in India. That abstraction of eternal sleep developed itself into the triad of Brahma, Kishnu, and Siva, a parody upon the revelation of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and these soon had their representatives in unnatural forms. From the mental image formed in a corrupt mind, it is but a short step to the golden or wooden idol in the temple. Every shape and form had its prototype in the imagination, which to the philosopher was supplemented by the material things of nature, but to the vulgar, surrounding objects were the basis upon which the superstructure of idolatry rested. Through the senses their imagination was fed by the things seen and felt, and though these be not the sole source of idolatry, they greatly modify its form and multiplied its gods. For the mountain and the valley, the river, the grove, the heavens above and the waters beneath had their divinities, and everywhere that which in nature most impressed man soon took rank as a god. Nor let us forget the greatest factor which produced this confused mass of superstition and credulity. Not only did man not like to retain the knowledge of God and thus become the dupe of his senses, but overall was the delusive power of Satan who held man in captivity through his fear and lusts. The loss of the knowledge of the true God, to a creature endowed with religious faculties, must result in subjective idolizing. Satan, the god of this world, presented himself in a tangible form and made it objective. The religion's element in man's nature was not eradicated by sin, but while every faculty of his mind and every instinct of his nature is debased and perverted, man's complete ruin and his greatest guilt are seen in the degradation of those same faculties originally given as the means for worshipping God. The endowments which placed him above all other creatures now sink him beneath them. After the flood, idolatry spread rapidly. For there was a void in man's breast which nothing that he had in common with the lower animals could meet. It was a religious want, and anything that pretended to satisfy it was adopted. Religious practices make one half the history of mankind. The ancient records as given by man are so full of fable that we turn at once to the Bible, where alone we get truth. Not that we shall find there a detailed history of idolatry as is given of faith, but facts here and there which prove its dominancy and universal spread. The first mention of idolatry is with Laban, whose images Rachel had stolen. That they were objects of worship is plain from his words, "Wherefore hast thou stolen my gods?" Nor was Jacob's household free from them till but a short time before the death of Rachel. Evidently, Laban and his family were idolaters. But it also appears that they had some superstitious knowledge of God, no doubt by tradition. There was a mingling of what they had received from earlier times with the image worship growing around them. And in such a case even to pay homage to the true God is only superstition. The name of God was not unknown, and the inhabitants of Mesopotamia pretended to revere it, but they joined idols with it. We might ask whether they made a difference in the degree of homage given to him who was to them the unknown God, and homage paid to idols. Was there such distinction practiced then as we find now expressed by the words latreia and doulia? A distinction which, where it is conceived, only deceives the ideator of the present day with the thought that he is a Christian. For as we see that one feature of ancient idolatry was not the denial of the name of God, but joining it with idols, so the doulia of the present day is joining virgin and saints, preferring them to Christ. It is idolatry. The next fact is in connection with Egypt, and we find an organized system and that the inhabitants had made some advance in national life. Idolatry had become a state religion. Egypt was a kingdom when Abram was leading a pastoral life, and the title of Pharaoh was given to their kings as afterwards that of Caesar was given to the Roman emperors, and we may reasonably infer that some progress was made both in political and religious cultivation. And later on, Egypt is found in commercial relation with other people. Merchants from Gilead, Ishmaelites, were going thither for trading purposes when they bought Joseph to sell there as a slave. There was a market for spicery, balm, and myrrh, and their readiness to purchase Joseph seems to say that he was not the first youth carried thither and sold into slavery. A slave market, as well as one for spicery, was held in Egypt. But the kingdom was not then so compact as when through the administration of Joseph the Egyptians were no longer proprietors of the soil, but mere tenants in capite and servants of the king, paying a fifth of the produce of the land as tribute to him. But if the individual lost his independence, the nation as a body politic gained power. Authority was centralized, one mind and one will were supreme. There could be no clashing of divergent opinions in cabinet councils, for the ministers had only to carry out the monarch's behests. When the king is wise and good, no form of government is more conducive to national prosperity and individual happiness. And when the Lord Jesus takes the kingdom of this world, it will be seen in infinite perfection. For it is God's purpose to give peace to the world by one man, the man of his right hand. The dream of this age is of universal peace through the predominancy of the popular element. Its motto is Vox Populi Vox Dei. It would be nearer the truth to say Vox Populi Vox Diaboli. But when God's king is seated on his own throne, it will be divinely and blessedly true to say Vox Regis Vox Dei. But the world must wait for his reign. No doubt idolatry was as prevalent before the king's authority established it as afterwards. But it is only authority that can organize it, and form it into a system. And thus it was when Joseph was in Egypt, for the priesthood were a separate class, and Potiphar had the position of chief among them, his name bearing the signification of prince. And there were also magicians and wise men whom Pharaoh called to interpret his dreams. These are a class of men always found among idolaters. The cunning magician is the complement of the common idolater. Where the latter is, there will be found the wise man who fattens upon the ignorance of the common crowd. But superstition does not prevent secular order. Indeed, in a kingdom which is not a mere aggregation of savages, an organized system of religion, and of internal police regulations is always found. Potiphar was apparently chief in secular matters as Potipharah in the religious. There were other official dignities, though not so high in rank, as the chief butler and the chief baker. And so we are not surprised to find wealth and luxury where such as these exist. Joseph had his silver cup, and his chariot before which runners were to shout, "Bow the knee." These are sure evidences of material progress, and a measure of refinement. But there is with it, or had been up to the time of Joseph's advent to power, a corresponding advance in idolatry. And this is the point before us, that material prosperity aids the development of idolatry. And in Egypt, as in most countries since, the power of the state is used to enforce the religion of the state. From Genesis 47 verse 22 we learn that the priesthood was a distinct class, and maintained by the state, that is, a revenue was established and set apart for them. But when Joseph was appointed chief administrator of the kingdom, can we conceive him enforcing idolatry by law? No. Nor on the other hand, would he deprive the priests of sustenance. Thus while they received state pay, their public worship of idols would be prohibited. Joseph mounted at one step from the prison to the highest power. Only in the throne was Pharaoh greater than he. Inspired by God, he had interpreted the king's double dream, and God had given to the king and to all with him the conviction that the interpretation was a prophetic intimation of coming events. Insomuch that the king said the Spirit of God was in him, and therefore the fittest man to carry out the sage counsel he had given to the king. All submitted at once to the immense influence with which the manifest wisdom of God had clothed him. What then more probable than that Joseph was able to set aside the public observance of idolatry, and to bring the Egyptians at least outwardly to acknowledge the God of Joseph? The fact of his marriage with Asenath, the daughter of the prince-priest of On, seems to corroborate this. For On, a word meaning the son, which had the highest place in their mythology, shows Potipharah to he the high priest of their system. Is it not difficult to imagine if idolatry continued as before, that the daughter of the highest priest would be given to one who denied their gods, or Joseph could still he next to the king in authority? Possibly Potipharah and his daughter were true converts to the faith of one God, while the majority of priests restrained and forbidden to observe their idolatrous rites would be bitter enemies to Joseph and all his kindred. The priests naturally would seek to uphold the system which gave them importance and to retain their influence over the people. Indeed, we find that the Egyptians did keep up a distinction between themselves and Joseph's brethren. They would not eat with them, a presumptive if not a direct proof that in heart they clung to their old gods. While his influence lasted, and while the same dynasty occupied the throne, Joseph's laws and ordinances would be in force. But when about 2 centuries after a new king arose who knew not Joseph, a not unwilling people went back to their idolatry, and then the Israelites were subjected to a cruel tyranny. The words new king seem to express more than merely a successor, and point to a new dynasty. Does not Romans 9 verse 17 agree with this? Even for this same purpose have I raised thee up from amongst men. Possibly the whole dynasty clung to the tradition of Joseph and were driven from the throne through the adherence of the old religion gaining the ascendancy, and a new king, first of a new dynasty, who annulled all the decrees of Joseph, was placed on the throne. But all this I merely submit to the judgment of others and do not at all affirm as certain. The Israelites were contemned as being shepherds, an avocation which the Egyptians despised, and hence the kings who protected them were probably called the shepherd kings, and shared the same detestation, execrated as having impiously shut the doors of the temples, and thus bringing upon the nation the anger of the gods. Such was the record of a historian who, ages after, ascribed to idols the judgments that fell upon this Pharaoh. The cunning of the devil, the blindness of man are here most plain, for the judgments of God were against the idols. Satan makes man believe the gods did it as a punishment for shutting up their temples. This historian, Diodorus Siculus, says that a plague broke out in Egypt through the anger of the gods, because there were many foreigners there who practiced unknown rites in their worship, and in consequence, the ancient religion was neglected. The Egyptians feared that they would never be able to appease their gods unless they expelled all the strangers from their country. He mentions Danaus and Cadmus, but the greater number of the expelled was under the conduct of Moses, a wise and brave man, who led his followers into Judea and there built Jerusalem and the temple, and who pretended to be inspired by Jah. This was written 12 centuries after the event, and through all that time this tradition which gave the glory of God to idols was received as the truth. Thus it is that Satan has always turned the truth of God into a lie. God's sore judgments were against idolatry. Satan persuades man that these judgments support it. It may be mentioned that chronologists assert that Danaus and Cadmus with their followers did arrive in Greece about the same time that Moses and the Israelites departed from Egypt. The next mention of idolatry is in connection with the chosen people. They made a calf, no doubt in imitation of the Egyptian Apis. The image of the calf brought to mind the accustomed rites of its worship. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Israel in nature were as much idolaters as the Egyptians, and seeing their persistency in idolatry notwithstanding the ways and means of God to keep them from it, no proof is greater of man being an idolater according to the principle of fallen nature. The same thing is seen at the end when they come to the borders of Moab. They went to the sacrifices of Moab's gods. The people did eat and bowed down to their gods. It is not only that the Gentiles were wholly given to it, but Israel, to whom is the adoption and the glory, and the covenant and the law-giving, and the services, and the promises. Even the judgments of God did not overcome their love of idols. We have seen how the name of God was mixed up with their false worship. Laban could speak of God, Pharaoh, that the Spirit of God was in Joseph, and the idolatrous revelry of the Israelites at the foot of Sinai was called a feast to Jehovah. So in Micah's mother is another instance of this blasphemous mingling of the name of Jehovah with the image of silver she made. The silver was dedicated to Jehovah, and the manner of dedication was to make it into an idol and then worship it. The man Micah himself had a house of gods. And the ephod which God had provided for his own priest was used for idolatry. When Solomon was in the zenith of his power, his many wives led him to build high places for their gods. Indeed, idolatry was the besetting sin up to the time of the Babylonish captivity. Something of it was learned in Jacob's family. His beloved Rachel had her images. It was better learned in Egypt, and never did the Israelites cease to be idolaters until removed from the land, perhaps not until the remnant were brought back to Jerusalem. Both Joshua and Stephen are witnesses that they were not free from it even in the journey through the wilderness. For Joshua bid them put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt. They had brought idols from Egypt and had retained them up to that time. And Stephen lays it to their charge in words which throw further light upon God's ways with them in the wilderness. They made a calf in those days and worshipped it. Then God turned and gave them up. That sin of the calf was the primary cause of their captivity beyond Babylon. But the point I would especially notice now is that Stephen charges them with idol worship while in the wilderness. Ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch, and the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye made. See Acts 7 verses 41 to 43. Idolatry has one invariable effect: it degrades the moral part or the soul. The writings of men who were idolaters, which treat of metaphysics or science, show no want of intellectual power, nor does the literature of that age fail to command the respect of the present, when morality and its obligations are not the theme. And no marvel, for true morality can only be learned from the Bible. Ancient philosophy discourses grandly about it, but never was it observed for its own sake. For the sake of renown great things were done, for the sake of praise a man would be honest and truthful, but to love and follow whatsoever was of good report, honest, true, etc., for their own sake, and this is true morality, is ascribing to human nature a quality which it cannot possess. Nor have I introduced heart reference to God, without which nothing is right in heart or practice. Idolatry cannot instill the love of what is pure and lovely and of good report. On the contrary, it engenders and strengthens the feelings and sentiments of all that is hateful and impure. And as we know in many instances, it has crushed the strongest instincts of nature, for parents have burnt their own children in honor of an idol. At other times the devotees are seized with a sort of frenzy or madness as the priests of Baal, 1 Kings 18, who cried out and after their manner cut themselves with knives and lancets till the blood gushed out. Nothing here surely is of good report. Nor were such things of exceptional occurrence, that and the licentiousness and drunkenness seen, perhaps not less in classic Greece and Rome than among the Canaanitish worshippers of Ashtaroth. All these form the ritual of idolatry. The voices of the prophets declare that Israel had sunk into all these depths of corruption and cruelty, that, while pretending to the knowledge of God, they equaled, if not even excelled, the heathen in the practice of all those abominations. To keep them from this horrible wickedness God put a hedge around Israel. They were a walled vineyard, with a tower and a winepress in it. His power to protect and his goodness to cheer, also a social hedge, for they were not to intermarry with the nations outside, all intercourse being forbidden, except as individual Gentiles should break away from their own kindred and become proselytes to the faith of one God. A moral hedge was then put around them, which had special reference and bearing upon the idols of Egypt. Such was the law and the ordinances given to them. The great need of a wall of separation, if it were possible to keep Thorn from idolatry, was seen at the very moment that God was providing the means for it, for then it was, remembering Egypt's idols, they made one like it. The first commandment struck at the root of idolatry. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. There were many other gods in Egypt, likenesses of things in heaven above and in the earth beneath, and in the waters under the earth, the sun and the moon, Osiris and Isis. Animals also were the objects of superstitious homage, as the ox, the dog, the cat, the hawk, the crocodile, and others. Nor did they limit their reverence to animals, but even deified the vegetables that grew in their gardens. Leeks and onions were invoked as gods. Had we not unimpeachable evidence of such amazing debasement, it would be incredible. It is the derision of one who was himself an idolater. You enter, says Lucian, into a magnificent temple, every part of which glitters with gold and silver. You there look attentively for a god, and are cheated with a stork, an ape, or a cat, and he adds a just emblem of too many palaces, the masters of which are far from being the brightest ornaments of them. The doctrine of the metempsychosis, which is said to have originated with the Egyptians, was a natural outcome of such a system of idolatry. For the soul to pass into the body of one of the sacred animals must by them have been esteemed a great honor. Modern apologists of idolatry, for what else can they be, have said that worship was not paid to the animals, but to the gods of whom they were the symbols. So exactly said the philosophic heathen of old. But the vulgar saw only the animal, and though the philosopher might despise, he had to hide his contempt. Paul at Ephesus was in danger of his life because by his preaching many were turned away from the worship of Diana and from the image which fell down from Jupiter. The intellectual at Ephesus might think of Diana, but the common people only saw the image which they were told fell down from heaven. The rude block or sculptured stone, the little images that Rachel hid in the camel's furniture, or the great image of gold in the plain of Dura, even the lowest animal, or the common leek filled the eye of the ignorant masses and nothing beyond. Another commandment was, Thou shalt not take the name of Jehovah thy God in vain. To take his name in vain is not merely uttering it in vulgar oaths, but what is equally, if not more offensive to God, the associating it with idols. This was done in Egypt. One or more of the divine attributes was applied to the sun, to the moon, and to each of their idols. Nay, the incommunicable name of self-existence was found, as Plutarch records, as an inscription in one of their temples. I am all that has been, is, and ever shall be. Where did the Egyptians get the idea of self-existence? There was evidence of the Creator's eternal power and Godhead in the things that he had made, but man lost sight of him, and fixed his eye upon the creature, and looking only there ignored its evidence. And his mind, outside the testimony of creation, was incapable of conceiving it. Where else could the Egyptians have had this absolute, and to man incomprehensible, yet necessary expression of the one supreme being, than from Moses, who said I am had sent him? What more likely than when the Egyptian priests had witnessed the power of I am by the hand of Moses they transferred that name to their God? Is not this the most offensive feature in idolatry, the giving the glory of God to another, and his praise to graven images? See Isaiah 42 verse 8. But this gives evidence that whatever notion the heathen had of one God, it came first from a source opposed to idolatry. Afterwards, fable being mixed with truth, the name of the Absolute was given to idols, and the truth which condemns the worship of idols was used to maintain it. No deeper dishonor can be to the Creator God. Again, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. The Egyptians dedicated each day of the week to one of their gods. Processions and obscene mirth characterized the homage paid to them. Jehovah commanded the Israelites to keep holy the Sabbath day, and the divine reason for the consecration of this day is that God after the 6 days' work of creation rested on the seventh day. After the work of 6 days, the command was imperative to rest on the seventh. It is not a bare permission but a command and in effect the prohibition of idolatrous feasts. Working 6 days and resting the seventh cut off all opportunity for the riotous feasts of idolatry, and the special guard of the law against it is plain. Moreover, we see that idolatry interferes with God's arrangements for the social order of everyday life. Among the heathen, starting from Egypt every day of the week was consecrated to some idol. The same signification of name for each of the 7 days is found in the East, in the barbarous North, and in Rome when it was the great center of civilization and of the world's power. The same names used by pagans are retained by Christendom, names in honor of some god, and a proof how widespread that form and aspect is, that had its development if not its origin in idolatrous Egypt. In our own land, the Quakers made a vain attempt against these pagan names by adopting the terms, first day, second day, etc., but they were too deeply implanted to be uprooted by such an isolated body. What is in a name? Nothing per se. But the fact of identity of names proves that the stream of idolatry which issued from Egypt has washed the shores of other countries in Asia and in Europe. When the Lord Jesus was here on the earth he condensed the whole law into 2 commandments. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, Matthew 22. If the first and great commandment strikes at the root of idolatry, the second no less denounces the fruits of it. The sins forbidden in the second table of the law are the fruits of the flesh truly, but they flow direct from idolatry, and when the Lord Jesus said thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, he summed up in a word the whole second table of the law. Idolatry forbids none, permits all, sanctions some, for the feasts observed in praise of their idols were the occasions for excess of riot, and debauchery was the incense offered to them. The morality of idolaters is on a par with their worship. Their moral sense was governed by superstition, this led them to vice that allowed no check. Honor to parents is the first thing in the second table. The Egyptians, like the Spartans afterwards, paid respect to old age, but this might be paid where there was no honor rendered to parents such as the law enjoined, and of which obedience is the essence. Whether this commandment was commonly observed by the youth of Egypt, or not, we know that filial obedience forms no part of the code of idolatry, nor does it forbid anything that the law of God forbids. On the contrary, the 2 next prohibitions are sanctioned. The Egyptians annually sacrificed a girl, and some affirm a boy and a girl to the Nile. In cities called Typhonian at certain seasons, men were immolated. Theft and false witness were venial. Not the perpetration of the crime, but the discovery of it was considered shameful. Such was the condition into which idolatry plunged mankind. Nor is this the worst aspect of it. It was far worse, and so displayed in Israel and Judah that the images of the gods whose worship sanctioned such abominations were placed in the temple of Jehovah. It was lowering the true God to the level of their idols. As with the Gentile so with the Israelite, their gods were not only the deifying the worst passions of man, but the blinded and perverse mind fastened upon the objects around it and clothed them with supernatural power. All that was grand or fearful, all that inspired awe or admiration, was deemed the dwelling place of a god. Day and night, the winds, the sea were presided over by an imaginary deity. A god was found on the mountain top, and in the gloomy cavern. The smiling cornfield and the dark recesses of the forest, rivers, fountains, each had its tutelary divinity. Gradually, near the sacred places, temples were raised, and a symbol of the god placed therein, then homage paid to it until at last, even the imaginary deity had to give place to the material idol. If amid all this darkness there was with some the faintest idea of a soul power or being above all, as with the Athenians, Acts 17, it was only that he was too high and too great to be concerned with man. A god unknown must have his shrine, but the true God was unknown, for he is so much concerned with man that in his love he gave his only begotten Son to die for him, that believing he might not perish but have everlasting life. If we turn for a moment to secular writers we find that this notion of an Oshios god largely obtained in the East, in India. Among the Hindus, their supreme was so wrapped up in his own perfections as to commit the charge of this world to inferior deities, and therefore in his relation to men and things above in eternal sleep. This was their Brahm, who in his primary state is a being without qualities or attributes, without intellect, without consciousness, without intelligence. A being without these is an impossibility. The supreme is the absolute nothing. But Brahma wakes to consciousness. How such a non-entity could is a marvel, and then he becomes omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and exclaims I am. And this is where the vaunted intellect of man leads us when it press into the regions above mere matter. Western philosophy does not travel by the same route, but its last stage is not less absurd. For if the Hindu, in his mythological journey back to the original cause of all, arrives at eternal sleep, confusion, or chaos, with the eternity of matter, is the ultima thule of the pagan West, where was found no other solution of the problem of good and evil as seen in the present condition of creation, than that each is eternal and was ever in conflict. Historians say that idolatry as a system was carried from Egypt to India after the age of Joseph, or about the year BC 1635, or a little later. That afterwards the same organized system spread from the northeast of Asia to the northwest of Europe and prevailed throughout this region before BC 542. The Hindu doctrine of Brahm seems to confirm this. God's assertion of himself as I am could never have been conceived by fallen man, and it must have been carried to India from the land where that name was first declared. Those who have examined Hindu mythology assert that its fundamental doctrine is one God. What kind of God it is we have just seen. If so, then there is the fact of God's revelation of himself as the one God, to the Gentile world, the responsibility of the idolater in presence of this revelation, and the perversion of this truth by man, under the power of Satan. Divergent in detail and development as the system became in different countries, its identity as to source is also seen in that time is reckoned by weeks and days, and that the days of the week are consecrated to the same or similar gods. See note. Note. The days of the week are thus known, see Encyclopedia Metro. Volume 9. Intro, in the Indian, Roman, and North Europe or Scandinavian languages, and I add the corresponding English names. Andati war a dies solis, the sun's day a Sunday. Soma war a dies luni, the moon's day a Monday. Mangala war a Martis dies, Visco's day a Tuesday. Buddha war a Mercurii dies, Woden's day a Wednesday. Vrihaspat war a Iaves dies, Thor's day a Thursday. Shukra war a Veneris dies, Freya's day a Friday. The Miskir war a Saturni dies, Cedar's day a Saturday. End of note. History of idolatry. There are also other traces of Egyptian idolatry. The Ganges in India was accounted sacred as the Nile in Egypt, the sun in both countries, in India a cow, reminding one of Apis. But the worship of cats and dogs, of leeks and onions, is not found in India. Their idolatry took a somewhat different direction. Symbols of their gods were not sought for among the brutes, or in their kitchen gardens. They multiplied their gods, but as a rule, all were in the shape of men and women, sometimes with a monstrous and unnatural addition or change when a particular attribute or quality was to be made prominent, as when the head of an elephant was given to a human body to express prudence and sagacity, also 4 arms to show power. As an expression of an abstract idea, it is that of an untutored and perhaps childish mind, but from an aesthetic point, the Hindu idol is disgusting and repulsive. The ancient form of Hinduism differs from its present, which is known under the name of Brahmanism. But a mere glance at the course of idolatry after its authoritative establishment and organization in Egypt does not require more than the notice of the transition from the pantheistic aspect of the ancient Hindu mythology to the fundamental idea of one god, as Brahm, with polytheistic associations. There is another idolatrous system, that of Buddha. This is said to be less gross and barbarous than Brahmanism. While Brahm is a myth, Buddha may have been a real personage who, disgusted with the cruelties practiced by the Brahmins, formed a sect of his own. But the Buddhists were driven out of India and settled principally in Ceylon. Some went to China, others to Tartary, and possibly even to Scandinavia. The Brahmins, on the contrary, would not go beyond the limits of India, their sacred region. In their emigration, the Buddhists carried images of Buddha into these countries whither they went, and worshipped him as supreme, but mixed with his worship some of the Brahminical or Egyptian mythology. Thus the stream of that system of idolatry which had its beginning in Egypt has flowed thence over the greater part of the East, and a modification of it sweeping back overflowed all Europe. And this must have happened between the years BC 1635 and BC 542, for at the later date the Buddhists had been driven out of India. Among the Greeks and Romans the fabulous deities were not living animals, as are found with the Egyptians, nor images of unnatural shapes and forms as in India, though not quite free from the latter, as Pan with the feet of a goat, but by some of them certain animals, if not deified, were considered sacred to a particular deity, as the peacock to Juno. With these masters of the world idolatry seems divested of its bestial form, and unaccompanied with the more bloody rites observed in the north. By them idolatry was made attractive, clothed in forms of beauty and voluptuousness. Yet Jupiter, Venus, and Mercury are but different names for the Scandinavian Thor, Iria and Woden, and may be traced to the Egyptian Osiris and Isis. But if there be room for question as to the practical identity of the idols of one country with those of another, one thing is certain, that the same superstition, the same cruelty, lurks in all, that the particular character of the development of idolatry is in great measure due to the habits and education of the people of each country, and that, whatever the development, man is proved in all to be stupid, vile, and lost.